really every part of the history of New York really goes back to the map. New York exists where it does, and as this great city of connection, because it is situated at the confluence of two important geographic elements for trade. If we look at this map here, and specifically at the insert in the top left first, we can see that 1, New York sits at the bottom of a major river, the Hudson River, which stretches all the way up New York State into the heart of New England. And 2, that it lies on a smaller, heavily sheltered bay between Long Island and Staten Island that actually opens up into an even larger bay that connects into the wider Atlantic Ocean. Because of these two elements, someone with a boat in New York can both reach the rich interior resources of northeastern North America, think wood, plants, animals for fur and meat, ice, etc., as well as then easily move up and down the coast and across the ocean to Europe, Africa, South America, and beyond. And to top it all off, where those two things meet is an easily navigable, heavily protected interior bay. Now, because of that, the area that is now New York was actually long inhabited and valued by people before the arrival of Europeans. I'm talking, of course, about Native Americans. At least in the years directly before European arrival, New York was heavily and actively inhabited by Native peoples of the Algonquian cultural linguistic group, primarily of the Lenape tribe, who considered this whole area Lenape-Hoking, or the homeland. In fact, Broadway, the famous diagonal running street with all the theaters, largely follows the path of a pre-existing native trail that was used for hunting, trade, and general travel throughout Lenape-Hoking. Eventually, Europeans do arrive. And while there are several explorers that pass through New York, the first to establish a permanent presence are the Dutch, who arrive with Henry Hudson, thus the name of the river, in 1609. In 1614, they establish a colony at the bottom tip of Manhattan known as New Amsterdam. And while the Dutch were soon supplanted by the British, New York's Dutch origins are actually very important to the character of the city. The Dutch really established New York as a mercantile center for the lucrative North American fur trade, and they based their community on the values of free trade and, relatively for the time, wide-ranging religious tolerance, two principles that I would argue are at the bedrock of New York City's identity to this day. They did, however, also introduce slavery to the region and are infamous for basically swindling the local Lenape out of the area. They also famously cut off New Amsterdam from the rest of Manhattan with a giant wall across the entire island to keep the barbarians out. As you can see in the picture here, that wall stood for almost 200 years when it was eventually torn down, replaced by a bunch of banks, and renamed Wall Street. So it's a mixed legacy. Now, all of that changed in 1664, when the Dutch lost New Amsterdam to the British, who quickly renamed it New York. The British then continued much of the work that the Dutch had started. Using even more enslaved labor, they built New York into a real city and established it as the major center of their continent-wide American colonies. New York's trade and banking industries absolutely skyrocketed as it became the meeting point for northern New England goods, the agricultural products of southern plantations, and trade back to the United Kingdom and Europe. Now that lasts for about 100 years before 1776 rolls around and the American Revolution begins, pictured here in New York. Now, from a New Yorker, while Boston gets a lot of credit as the American stronghold, New York was really the big prize in that war. In fact, the war really began with Americans losing New York in the war's early battles, such as the Battle of Brooklyn in 1776. And then the war technically ended back in New York when George Washington made his final act as general to dismiss his troops from Fraunces Tavern in downtown Manhattan, which you can actually still visit today. Furthermore, America then made New York its first national capital, inaugurating George Washington as our first president here at Federal Hall, which you can also visit today. The capital has since moved to Washington, D.C. But from there, New York blossomed. The 1800s are kind of like New York's adolescent growth spurt. Across that century, New York's population grew from around 60,000 at the start to just about 3.5 million in 1900. A huge part of that was immigration from Europe, And of course, New York Harbor is home to the Statue of Liberty, gifted from France in 1886, as a now universal symbol for immigration and freedom. But New York also significantly grew after the Civil War with the Great Migration of African Americans north, making New York the largest urban community of the Black diaspora in North America by 1916. And of course, New York has been a center of Black culture since then, with the Harlem Renaissance kicking off around that time.